Hi, MSA family, friends, caregivers, and everybody else. This is Jimmy O'Brien,
And this is Marissa Eck.
and we're here for the fourth edition of the Behavior Beacon newsletter.
Mhm.
So, in this newsletter, last newsletter, we talked about consequences and payoffs. So this week we're going to talk about antecedents. Now, I just want to, before we actually get into it, I want to explain to people why is it that we didn't start with antecedents first. So in our ABC model, why would we not start with antecedents? Well, here's the reason. In behavior analysis, when we engage in a behavior, there's this really special, unique quality about consequences or payoffs. So when we come to the table, we're not really genetically prepared for certain things to trigger behaviors, with the exception of that kind of reflexive behavior that the Pavlovian kind of conditioning that you're all used to, emotional states, um, those kind of feelings. So in behavior analysis, when you engage in a behavior and there's a consequence of some feedback, consequences have really some unique properties. Not only does it reinforce a behavior, or in other words, the probability of you doing something, but it also, from an antecedent perspective, it endows events that happened before with properties. So it's not like you come out of the womb learning to scream and cry in front of a dad instead of a mom. That happens through its unique history. And that's why we wait at the end for antecedents. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. And I hope that makes sense. So like I said, in our last newsletter, we talked about consequences and their payoffs. So in this one, we're going to start to talk about antecedents. So when we mean antecedents, these are these events that occur before behavior that will, in some sense, create motivation and will trigger, in a sense, behavior. So more specifically, when we talk about antecedents, there are generally two types of antecedents. We'll categorize them as motivation and signals. So let's first discuss motivation. So motivation, these are dynamic changes in the environment that occur before behavior that have a very unique property as it relates to consequences. So there are these dynamic changes in the environment that have these two kind of effects. They will either make you want something more or less. So let me kind of take you through that with an example. And before I even get into that, when we say antecedents and motivation, I want you to consider three general types. One would be some state of deprivation, which in a sense will make you want something more.
Mhm.
A state of satiation or being full, which will make you want something less. And these uncomfortable feelings or emotions or conditions in the environment that will make you want to get out of something more. And when you don't have them, you don't want to get out of it. So I'm going to take you through an example specifically for me. So I don't know if most of you know, but the people who know me well know that I am a huge ice cream fan. I love ice cream. If given the option, I think that would be my thing I would choose to eat forever. I love it. I love it. I love it. So let's talk about how that motivation builds up for me. So if I haven't eaten ice cream in a long period of time, in other words, the time from my last ice cream bowl starts to kind of diminish. In a sense, as I become more and more deprived of ice cream, the value of ice cream increases. And as a result, would be much more likely to engage in ice cream getting behaviors. I might go to the kitchen, I might go to the freezer, I might even during these particular times get up and go to the store. But once I eat ice cream, what usually will happen is with each bite, and this does happen to me, even though you wouldn't see it on my body, each time I have a little bit of the ice cream, the value of it as a reinforcer will diminish. In other words, I get full, I get satiated. And ice cream as a reinforcer will lose its value. As such, it will also decrease all types of behaviors that have gotten the ice cream in the past. Why? Because I'm not motivated for it. I don't engage in behaviors unless I have motivation for it. And if I don't have motivation for it, then I don't need to engage in those particular behaviors. Marissa's going to talk in a few minutes about signals of when I might do that when I have motivation. Now, after I eat a lot of ice cream, what typically happens, I eat it really fast sometimes, and I will eat huge amounts. And when I tell you huge amounts, I cannot, um, It's a little too much information. That's all I'm going to say. But there are times where I eat a lot. And as a result of that, I get really nauseous sometimes. I get really full and I might get brain freeze. Now, there's your third type of motivation. Now, I'm in some state of uncomfortability. I'm in some pain. And now, what would function as a reinforcer would be from the removal of that pain. And as a result, I would be much more likely to engage in those behaviors that remove the pain. I might turn off the lights. I might rub my temples. I might ask my wife for an aspirin, which then she'll just say, you shouldn't have eaten the ice cream in the first place, but that's a different story. I might lay down. And once that uncomfortability goes away, what happens to those types of behaviors? Well, they slow down too. There's actually no need to engage in those behaviors. So kind of really quickly to sum up, when we think about motivation, it's these dynamic changes. They could either be slow acting or quick acting that will make you want something more or less. But in order to, once we're still missing one more piece of the puzzle, which is Marissa's going to talk about.
So now we're going to discuss signals. So in addition to what Jimmy just mentioned, super important motivation, so we also need to have some sort of signal in our environment that lets us know that reinforcement is available if we behave in a certain way. So think of signals as people, places, or things that we associate with those wanted reinforcers. So for Jimmy's example of ice cream, he may have some sort of association with a person, place, or thing with getting access to that reinforcer. Like he said, an ice cream store, or the fridge or whatever it might be, even a show that's on TV, something might signal him to do that. So for example, when I want motivation, ice cream, I don't walk to the bathroom. I don't walk to the closet. I don't go to the dog bowl. I go to the kitchen. This makes sense.
Right.
Marissa,
I just want to jump in there. If you do that, there's a lot of medications that will help alleviate.
Right. Exactly. When I'm in the kitchen, I don't go to the oven. If I want ice cream, I don't go to the sink. I go to the fridge and I open the freezer door. If I go outside for ice cream, I don't walk to the hardware store. I don't go to the craft store. I walk to the supermarket or the ice cream store. Now I want to take a second to just remember when we did things like that. We don't do that anymore, but that's okay. So why is that? Why do we do those things? Because certain places are associated with reinforcers at various times, depending on my motivation, and certain things are not. So in the future, we're going to talk about some signals for no reinforcement and when something that's not cool or something that's not as exciting is going to happen.
Okay, so with that, let's kind of now put that all together. So what we want to kind of take you through, because again, what we've been trying to do in these newsletters is to build up the conceptual analysis of the reasons why we might make recommendations about your particular context. So now when we can put it all together, we have antecedents, which is some event that creates motivation. We have signals, or those people, places, and things that will evoke behavior. We have what the learner says and does. And unfortunately, what we keep talking about is challenging behavior, but this is just the same for appropriate behavior. And then we have consequences or reinforcement or payoffs. Now that you have that kind of conceptual analysis, will be in a much better place to explain other interventions for you in particular context. Because our goal here is not to just give you guys a bag of tricks. This is a science that's been true and time tested for almost 100 years now. So we don't want this to be some bag of tricks. Or what we also, our real goal is, if we do make a recommendation, or some other discipline or other person makes a recommendation, you are more of an informed parent to understand why we might be making those recommendations. Because here's what you would not want to hear from someone. Well, why should I do that? Because I said so. We want you guys to critically think. So because you guys know your learners more than anyone else. And we want you to see that. It might be difficult because you're so personally, emotionally invested in it. But we're asking you at these particular times, step outside for a few seconds, and then you might see why we make certain recommendations over others. Or we might say, well, this recommendation, although it's good, it might not apply to this particular context. Okay, that's my soapbox moment. So let's see if we can kind of put it all together with some more realistic examples. So we're going to go through this chart. And again, this is not an exhaustive chart, but it'll kind of give you a general idea of some of the typical events that will typically occur in your learners' lives, certainly the ones that we see in school. And as we go through future newsletters, we will address, particular context. Okay, so here's the first one, right? So we have an antecedent, behavior, consequence. So let's talk about situations in which the parents or the siblings are busy. In your day-to-day interactions, you cannot always be with your learner. Sometimes you might have to cook, sometimes you just have to talk to someone else, or sometimes you just want to be on your own. As a father of a 14-year-old, I can tell you, for some reason, every time I see or my wife goes to the bathroom, my son needs our attention. He has to ask us something. Now, why, you think, why is that? Well, here's what typically happens. When we are not busy, when we are busy or doing something else, if you think about it, that creates motivation for our learners to want access to attention. So in other words, when I'm busy, in a sense, I'm depriving my learner of my attention,
Mhm.
which will only increase now the value of my attention as a reinforcer.
Mhm.
So now they have this motivation, but they don't just arbitrarily respond. They might go to a particular, and you ever notice this, they might go to a particular parent, right? More than others. Why? Because different parents have different types of signals as it relates to reinforcement. So for example, if you're busy and all of a sudden now your learner engages in some screaming, what do people usually do? They go, they run, they kind of figure out what's going on. It becomes circus time. So if you think about it conceptually, when we're not paying attention to our learners, when life is just busy, it makes them want our attention more valuable. Our learners now will engage in particular behaviors, whether appropriate or not, because we could talk about screaming or tantruming. We can also talk about appropriate things like asking lots of questions, saying, hey, watch me, look at me do this. And they only will do that in the presence of certain people who have provided that attention when that motivation is there. I hope that makes sense, because moving forward, that will be the type of analysis that we will use for any context when we either do Zoom sessions or when we do our future newsletters or any type of media content. We will take you through one of those conceptual analysis to explain why your learner might be doing it. Here are the environmental conditions that we think contribute to it, and then here's how we can prevent it, react to it, and then teach a more appropriate replacement behavior. So I went a little long-winded there, and I apologize for that, but Marissa will take you through the next one.
That's okay. No worries. Okay, so another context that I'm sure you guys are seeing pretty much every day, it would be a scenario where I'm a student. I don't want to do something that I've been asked to do. And my mom asked me to do it. And let's say she's putting work in front of me, or it's a Zoom video, or it's some sort of activity, or having to clean up an activity to go to another activity. But the signal there is my parent that asked me to do it. And I then engage in screaming. I might cry, I might throw things at her. And then the motivation to get me to stop is really high for my mom. My mom wants me to stop throwing. My mom wants me to stop screaming and throwing. So she says, whoa, 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 never mind. You don't have to do it. Again, we will talk about later in later newsletters how that can put you in like a bit of a power struggle for the future, because now the next time I don't want to do something, I know that screaming, crying, and throwing works to get mom to say, never mind, you don't have to do it. Jimmy, you can take the next one.
Sure. So another one is usually some states of deprivation as it relates to items. A sibling might be playing with a favorite toy, or your learner is playing with a toy and a sibling comes along and grabs it abruptly, or even in situations where your learner or your child is playing with something and now it's time to terminate it. So think about what happens from an antecedent perspective. Learners playing with something that they really like, and now for what happens environmentally, it's taken away, right? So there's your kind of motivating event. An item gets taken away, which will now make that the consequence or the payoff of getting it back much more valuable, even stronger, right? And again, I'm hinting here is like when we talk about transitions, or when some of our families have been asking like what happens when the Zoom session is over, the iPad has to go from fun to work. And this is what we're kind of hinting at. So something gets removed, which increases now its value to get it back. And now the learner might engage in some challenging behavior. But who do they engage that to? They don't run up to the dog. They don't run up maybe to the sibling. They'll go to that person who is usually correlated with that. And unfortunately right now, that is usually someone in the immediate environment, a family member. You can take the next one, Marissa?
Yeah. So the next one, I'm sure we've had a lot of conversations with parents about this specific context where there's a chance that a child is bored or understimulated. And the signal there is that their hands are free and that there might be some random items around. So I'm looking at my desk right now, and if I'm bored, I have my cell phone, I have my notebook, I have some chapstick, I have some pens I can organize, I have a water bottle. But for some of our kiddos, they may not engage appropriately with their activities. They may, their hands may be free, they have nothing to do, so they may engage in some hand flapping, or they might engage in some repetitive play, or they may start twirling things. And the reason they're doing that, and the payoff, is that it feels good. And the expectation for them to do something else isn't there. We haven't potentially given them those leisure skills yet to say, oh, I'm free. Instead of hand flapping, I'm going to go play with this. So that takes a lot of time to kind of create that association there. So we are hearing this a lot from our families, that where, if a parent is on a phone call and they're looking at their kiddo might be engaging in something that's not contextual or not functional right now. So the reason being, or the payoff that we want you guys to think about, is, why are they doing that? Well, they don't know what else to do, and it feels good.
Yeah. And here's the last one. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I just if I can categorize this for you, if you look at the first three, those are situations in which another person controls the reinforcer, right? I engage in a behavior, another person gives me attention. I engage in a behavior, another person takes things away from me. I engage in a behavior, I get fun things in addition to attention. The last two are a little bit more trickier. And why is that? Is because these are behaviors in which the learner is producing their own payoff or reinforcement, which makes it even much more trickier to kind of work with it. And in future newsletters, we'll talk about preventative antecedent strategies that will alleviate some of those things, so that it decreases the future probability that they might engage in self-stimulatory behavior or some of this aversive kind of behavior to remove their own kind of aversion. So the last one basically is for situations in which internally there's some uncomfortability. It could be that there's a negative emotion, some kind of biological or physiological response, which would only increase the value of its own removal as a reinforcer. And as a result, we might, the learner might engage in things to alleviate that uncomfortability, that aversive quality, if you will. So in this example here, we talk about things like the Zoom video might be too loud or overstimulating or uncomfortable for them. And as a result of that, getting away from that would be the consequence or the payoff. And as a result of that, what signals the availability of escaping? Well, if they're eloping or running away to another room, it's a door. The door signals that if I go through that particular configuration, I'm able to alleviate my own discomfort, my own emotional feeling, that uncomfortability, if you will. So again, these are some of the ways to kind of conceptualize all types of behavior, whether appropriate or inappropriate. The reason why we want to kind of put it all together, like I mentioned before, is because as now we start to move forward and we get into very specific contextual issues, or some of your most frequently asked questions, it will be this analysis that we will first talk about first. We will always talk about, what does this mean conceptually? And then we will then outline for you proactive, reactive, and adaptive strategies. And then from there, the question will become, what are you willing to do given these current circumstances? Because it's not going to be easy. Some of it will be easy, some of it will not. And when we talk about more of the reactive stuff, that can be a little bit more difficult. And we'll get into that in future newsletters. So let's kind of give you some tips of the week based upon this newsletter. I know it's a little long-winded, but I do think it's an important topic. So here's some of the tips of the week. You want to take the first one?
Sure. So first tip of the week is, we would love to see you guys start thinking about motivation. Think about what motivates you, and think about what sort of things motivate your children. These are conversations we're having quite often in our consults with parents, where this conversation is centralized a lot of like, well, I don't really know what they like. I don't know what they're interested in. I bet you, if you, like Jimmy said earlier, if you step out of it, you could come up with a list of things that might be considered that to motivate your child. And I think it's really important to think about that, especially now that we are in this distance learning dynamic, because things that might not look fun, or they might not, they're around your home, or they might be old toys or old activities. if you make them available again, they might be things that you could use to kind of motivate them to come close to a Zoom session or attend to a therapy session, or to keep themselves busy when you're on the phone
Yeah.
or doing something for work.
And now that we've kind of addressed this motivation thing, we talked about deprivation and satiation, you can start to understand why, when we've, spoken to some of you guys, why we recommend finding, or even specifically in toilet training, why we specifically say find that one reinforcer that they only get if and only if they engage in appropriate behavior. And what we're basically saying is, in order to strengthen a behavior, let's create a state of deprivation so that the reinforcer or that contrast, that feedback that you give your learner really stands out. If you have a reinforcer that they get for everything, there's not going to be a good contrast. So when we say, can you find a reinforcer, or can you hold this reinforcer off until we do this? What we're basically saying is, can you create a state of deprivation so that that reinforcer, when it's delivered upon something that your learner says or does, will really strengthen that. So I want you guys to start to understand that when we make these recommendations, there is a basic principle that accounts for it. And it's not just, well, Jimmy said this, or Marissa said this, or the BCBA person said this. There's a rhyme and reason for everything. In a sense, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. We're pulling back the curtain to let you see that these are the levers that are being, operating in your learner's environment. Again, soapbox, I apologize, but I love this stuff. Okay. 2, think about those particular signals unique to your child during the situations where they're motivated for something. So what do we mean by that? In situations like where your learner might engage in challenging behavior, here's what we always say. Where does the learner go? If a child is having a tantrum, are they more likely to have a tantrum with mom? Are they more likely to have a tantrum with dad? Are they more likely to be better with mom or dad? Or is it when grandma's there, all hell breaks loose? And there's a reason behind that. Now, we're certainly not trying to catch people like, well, you're the person there, but it does indicate that in states of motivation, that the learner has learned to associate particular people with paying off. Probably, for example, don't do it with mom because mom does not pay off as much as dad does. Here at my house, my wife and I are 2 different states. When it's time to do homework, when my wife says to Nick, time to do homework, we get into negotiating behavior. Why? Because there's a payoff. He can delay the task. When dad says to do homework, he does it right away because I signal something completely different, which we'll talk about in future newsletters. But on the opposite end, when it's time to play video games or buy a new video game, he comes to dad first. Why? Because I signal the availability of getting video games. Okay. Marissa, you want to take the last one?
Yeah, I think going back though to number 2 is we hear a lot of the time the good cop, bad cop analogy from families. And this is a really good example of that, where what Jimmy's saying exactly there, like when it comes to homework, his wife is the good cop and Jimmy is the bad cop. But there's a reason for that. That doesn't just happen out of, that's not magic. That's not something that just happens out of nowhere. There's a reason for that. Jimmy signals something and his wife signals something else. So think about that in your own family dynamic, not just with you and your spouse, but also if you have other children or other caretakers that work with you. Think about where and what does your child do specifically with certain people in their circle.
Right.
I think that's going to be really helpful.
One more thing to add to that. Also remember, you as a signal will change depending on your child's motivation. So it's not that, oh, you're always correlated with getting good things. You can change very quickly. And that's what's the most tricky part of this analysis, is that our motivations, think of it like a lava lamp, right? You have these things that will kind of bubble. There's a whole bunch of them. And at one moment, one bubbles up, and then it kind of drops down, and another one kind of bubbles up. So life for us and all living organisms is not linear in the sense that I just want attention, I don't want to do things, I'm uncomfortable. It is a constant state of fluctuation. Our job is to figure out at that given moment which one it might be. Now, we're going to kind of hint here is that sometimes it's just not one thing. Life isn't just one little discrete unit, which makes it a little bit more difficult for the analysis, but that does not necessarily mean we cannot do the analysis. the guy I always seem to quote is B.F. Skinner. In 1953, he wrote Science and Human Behavior. And one of the chapters, he talked about the analysis of complex cases. And what he says in that is, in order to understand complexity, we have to start simply. And that's the purposes of these newsletters, is to give you the bare bones minimum of these basic principles so that we can talk about more complex things. As we start to put all this stuff together for you guys, we will be able to talk about more in-depth, complex things that are just not your basic challenging behavior. We can talk about thinking and language and functional skills, all the things that encapsulate us as individuals. And it's all those things that we say and do at particular times and places. Sorry.
That's
I
okay.
guess
I knew
you got
he's
the
gonna
last one?
quote B.F. Skinner at some point, guys. So it happened. Finally happened.
You're
Okay.
lucky I'm not wearing my shirt.
Okay.
Maybe next
The
one.
last tip is just start thinking about various environmental events that either decrease or increase the value of your child's reinforcer. So what do we mean by that? So start thinking about, I mean, right now, unfortunately, the environment you're in is the environment you're stuck in. So thinking about the environment that you are currently in and what sort of things happen in that environment, who is around, what signals what, is it before dinner, is it after dinner, is it in the middle of the day, is it after they napped, is it before they napped? Think about the things that happen naturally that typically we don't think about because they just are happening in your day. Try to take apart piece by piece kind of what is going on in the environment and how that affects the level of the decrease or increases the motivation level for certain reinforcers for your kiddo.
Awesome. All right, so let's finish up with a nice quote. We always try to tie it together with some quote. So this is from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. For many people, one of the most frustrating aspects of life is not being able to understand other people's behavior. I think this nicely kind of ties into what our mission statement is of these newsletters. We are trying to give you a different perspective of looking at your learner's behavior from a behavioral perspective. Doesn't mean it's the only way, but Marissa and I are both behavior analysts, licensed behavior analysts. So this is what the show is going to make. You get what you paid for. So this is how we look at things. And we do hope that these newsletters will get you to see things a little bit differently so that they can empower you and help you not only through this particular time, but just moving forward. You know, you guys are with your learners, and you're the best advocates, and you're the best teachers, you're the best social workers. You are everything to them. And we hope that as we move forward in these newsletters, that you're getting something out of it. You're understanding things a little bit differently so that you can make these in the moment changes and make these decisions that help impact your learner. Not better than, but in addition to.
Mm-hmm.
So again, here's our contact information. We're not going to read it again. You guys know that we keep saying that every time. We just want to also say that we really enjoy jumping in to the Zoom sessions. We really love it when you guys reach out to us and we have those one-to-ones where we can kind of work on these things. We're hoping that as we put together this portal, we're going to have much more content for you. And I want to end it off by saying, if you guys have any particular questions that we might not have addressed or going to address, send us an email and ask that question. What our plan to do is to create a resource of frequently asked questions. And in that, we will do is we'll put up the question, and it'll be Marissa and myself, maybe with and Aisha, with some PowerPoint, and we'll talk you through the conceptual analysis of it and then what we might recommend. It does not mean what you have to do, but again, what we might recommend from this perspective. So with that, I hope you guys are well. I hope you guys are trying to maintain. I hope you guys are making sure you keep your safety masks on. And what I mean by that, emotionally, physically, psychologically, I hope you're taking times to kind of, in a sense, get away or escape your own uncomfortability so that you can recharge. And as always, together, we will do this. I'm Jimmy O'Brien.
Marissa. Bye,
See you
guys.
around.